Guys, let's talk about trim tabs real quick, just some basics of it. You're familiar with your elevator, your rudder, and your aileron, help you control your pitch, your roll, and your yaw. And aircraft will typically have trim tabs on those surfaces. You'll have an aileron trim tab, you'll have a rudder trim tab, and you'll have an elevator trim tab on top of the larger control surfaces themselves. The larger control surfaces can seesaw and weather vane back and forth. They're like hinges, and the trim tabs are more rigid. They're more locked into place, and they have to be physically moved into other positions, whereas the ailerons, rudders, and elevators are free to kind of flap back and forth in the breeze. Now, trim on a control surface, this red triangle being a control surface, it doesn't matter which one. We could be looking at a rudder, an aileron, or an elevator, but the trim is just going to be right here on this little back side, and this is what it's going to look like at the neutral position. Just nice, flat, in line with the actual control surface itself. And the control surface is free to be manipulated by the pilot, deflected upwards or downwards here. And if no input is being, no force is being exerted upwards or downwards, and there's a direction of travel against airflow, then this control surface will weather vane into the path of least resistance so that that airflow can go around it smoothly, and it'll just come into a natural resting position here. But if we want this elevator or aileron or rudder to be deflected one way or another, and we didn't want to have to fight this flow of air and hold against it for long durations of time, what we could do is knock this little flap up or down, such as in this picture, where we've got this little trim tab right here notched just upwards slightly. And what that does is cause this flow of air coming around to encounter an obstacle that it now has to divert around. And as it diverts around it, it's going to cause a lateral push on this control surface, which causes it to move in the direction of these red arrows. So trim tab goes this way, control surface goes the opposite direction. And the aircraft is going to respond to that by moving with that moment. So let's say this was an elevator and we were looking at it from the side. Your trim tab goes up, elevator goes down. That causes the nose to drop, right? And then the exact same thing in reverse. You bring your elevator trim down into a positive position. Down being positive is counterintuitive, but flow with me on this. You bring your trim tab into a positive position downwards, which causes your elevator to deflect upwards, which causes your aircraft to enter a climb, as that flow of air has to now encounter this obstacle and push on the elevator to get around it. Now your trim tab has variable positions in it. It's not just stuck in going upwards a certain amount or downwards a certain amount. You can notch it by a certain amount of degrees. And once it's in that position, you can leave it there or you can continue to adjust it. Now, if you don't change your engine power or your trim tab settings and you do not exert any force on the control surfaces, the only thing that can change, that would change the orientation of your aircraft, is going to be the flow of air encountering this trim tab. If the flow of air is faster, it's going to exert more force on the trim tab, pushing on your control surface more. And if the air starts moving slower, it's going to push on your trim tab less, and it's going to allow this control surface to be deflected less. So you got to think of airflow like a multiplier of trim. The faster the air flows across this control surface, it multiplies that deflection value to give you a greater force of change to the aircraft. And the same thing in reverse, if that airflow is slower, you get less of a multiplication factor and less change of force to the aircraft based on the same deflection value. Now that's the basics of trim. And what I'd like to do is show you how this changing airflow can sort of teeter-totter your aircraft back and forth in like smaller and smaller sine wave patterns until your aircraft naturally finds an equilibrium. And I want to just sort of talk through that process. So what we've got here is an FW190 F8 that is being, it's just been trimmed in another video that I made about specifically trimming in War Thunder. I'll link that in the details. But this aircraft is done being trimmed, and I have just respawned it, and it is at an unusual attitude and recovering. You can see it's kind of violently oscillating there, up and down, but it's already trimmed, and I'm not touching the controls, I'm not touching the pedals, I'm just sitting back and letting the trim do its thing. And as the nose comes up, the aircraft is slowing down. That makes the trim less effective. That makes the nose drop back down. As the nose drops back down, the speed comes back up. That helps the trim become more multiplied and helps bring that elevator into a positive position and allows you to start climbing again. But as you start climbing, you start losing that airspeed, and the whole cycle repeats. But every time you climb and you overshoot your mark, you don't overshoot it by as much every time. Maybe your mark is 230 knots, and the first time you go up to 250, and you go way, way higher than 230. And your nose goes way high, and you lose a whole ton of speed, and your speed drops so much that you start falling like a rock. And as you're falling, you pick up a bunch of speed, and that helps your nose come back up. But the second time your nose comes up, instead of getting up to 250 knots, maybe you get up to 240 knots. And still an overshoot. You wanted 230, but it's not as much of an overshoot. So you don't have as much of an overcorrection here, and you don't quite get the nose up as high. You don't quite lose as much speed before your nose comes back down. You start to recover. And then the same thing on the bottom swing. You don't build as much speed before your nose comes back up. So the downward correction gets smaller, and then it just keeps getting smaller and smaller until eventually the aircraft just sort of like finds the flow. It finds that equilibrium. And unless I change my throttle or change my aileron trim value or change my trim value or take some battle damage or something like that or exert some force on the stick, my aircraft's just going to kind of chill like this. And that's trim.